The dust in Harmony Creek settled on everything, a fine, gritty shroud that covered windowsills, coated the weary leaves of the cottonwood trees, and found its way into the very souls of its people. For Eliza May Thompson, it felt like the dust of a life already lived and laid to rest. At 28, she moved through her days with the quiet, ghost-like gait of a woman twice her age, her world confined to the four walls of the small house she shared with her widowed sister, Martha, and the short, treacherous path to the general store. It was a world made small by whispers. "There she is." "Mrs." Gable would murmur to a neighbor from behind a hand, her eyes sharp and merciless as a hawk's. "Poor thing, pretty as a peach, but the branch she grows on is dead, barren ground." The words, and others like them, had followed Eliza for 2 years, ever since her husband, a proud farmer named Thomas, had sent her back to her family. He hadn't used the word the townspeople did. He had been quieter, his cruelty wrapped in a cloak of pity. A man needs sons to carry on his name and work his land. "Eliza," he'd said, his gaze fixed on a point just over her shoulder. "It ain't your fault. It's just God's will." But the shame he'd branded her with was as public and permanent as if he'd taken a hot iron to her skin. In a world where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to fill a cradle, Eliza was deemed worthless. Martha, whose own husband had been taken by a fever 3 winters prior, was a pragmatic and hardened woman. She offered Eliza a roof over her head, but little comfort. "Keep your head down," she'd advise, her hands relentlessly kneading dough on the floured tabletop. "Let them talk. Their words can't break your bones." But they could, and they did. They chipped away at Eliza's spirit until all that was left was a hollow ache, a longing for a place where her name wasn't synonymous with failure. It was this longing that led her to the newspapers. When Martha was at the creek, washing linens or visiting the cemetery, Eliza would carefully unfold the week-old copy of the Matrimonial Times she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room. Her fingers, calloused from mending and scrubbing, would trace the tiny print of the advertisements. Widower. 45, seeks honest woman of good character for companionship and to make a home. Owns profitable smithy. No drinkers or dancers need apply. Rancher in Montana territory. Sober and hard-working. Desires a wife to share in the building of a new life. Must be willing to face hardship and isolation. Photograph requested. Each ad was a tiny flicker of hope in the suffocating darkness of her existence. These men, far away in places with names like Echo Canyon and Wolf Point, didn't know the story of Eliza Thompson. They wouldn't see the pitying glances or hear the whispers. To them, she could be anyone. She could be whole. She imagined a life where her hands were valued for the bread they baked and the stitches they sewed, not judged for the child they had never held. It was a desperate, foolish dream, but it was the only one she had left. Hundreds of miles away, where the Texas plains stretched out under a sky so vast it could break a man's heart. Luke Callahan was facing a different kind of desolation. His ranch, the Broken Horn, was aptly named. The past 2 years of drought had cracked his land like old leather, and the creek that fed his pastures had dwindled to a muddy trickle. His cattle were thin, their ribs showing like the rungs of a ladder, and the fences that marked his property were leaning and broken, much like his own spirit. Luke was a man carved from the unforgiving landscape he inhabited. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a stormy sky. He'd buried his wife, Mary, 3 years ago, a victim of a cholera outbreak that had swept through the county. She had been the light and life of the ranch, her laughter echoing in the small house, her garden a splash of defiant color against the brown earth. Now, the house was silent save for the small, hesitant footsteps of their 6-year-old daughter, Sarah. Sarah was a miniature version of her mother, with the same fiery red hair and solemn green eyes, but the light in her eyes had dimmed since Mary's passing. She was a quiet, watchful child, clinging to Luke's leg whenever he was near. Her world shrunk to the presence of her grieving father. Luke loved his daughter with a fierce, protective ache, but he knew he was failing her. He didn't know how to braid her hair properly, how to soothe her nightmares, or how to answer her heartbreaking questions about where her mother had gone. He was a man who knew cattle, horses, and the cruel whims of the weather. He did not know how to be a mother. The ranch was dying, and he feared a part of his daughter was dying with it. He needed help, not comfort, not love. He'd had that once, and its absence was a wound that would never heal. He needed a pair of capable hands, a woman who could manage a household, tend a garden, and bring some semblance of order and gentleness back into Sarah's life. Love was a luxury he could no longer afford. Survival was the only currency that mattered. So, one evening, by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, with Sarah asleep in her small bed, Luke sat at his rough-hewn table and composed a letter. His handwriting was stark and practical, the words chosen with the same economy he applied to everything in his life. Asterisk to the editor of the Matrimonial Times. Asterisk, I am a widower, 35 years of age. I own a cattle ranch in West Texas. I have a daughter, age 6. I am seeking a wife. She must be hardworking, in good health, and of a plain, honest disposition. I do not drink or gamble. I offer a home and protection. I do not offer poetry or promises of an easy life. The life here is hard. I need a partner, not a princess. Interested parties may write to Luke Callahan, Broken Horn Ranch, Sandstone, Texas. He sealed the letter without rereading it, a bitter taste in his mouth. It felt like a transaction, like he was ordering a new pump for the well or a sack of feed. But desperation was a hard master, and his had driven him to this. Weeks later, Eliza's trembling hands held a letter with a Texas postmark. The paper was rough, the ink stark and black. It was a reply to the letter she had sent, a letter in which she had laid her soul bare, confessing the truth of her past because she could not bear to begin a new life built upon a lie. Asterisk, Mr. Callahan. She had written, Asterisk, I have seen your advertisement. I am a woman of plain and honest disposition. I can cook, clean, mend, and tend a garden. I am not afraid of hard work, but there is a matter of which you must be aware. My first marriage ended because I was unable to provide my husband with a child. The doctors say it is unlikely I will ever bear children. I am what the world calls a barren woman. If you are seeking a wife to give you sons, I am not the woman for you. But if you are seeking a woman who will care for your home and your daughter as if they were her own, who desires nothing more than a place to belong and be of use, then I will gladly accept your offer. I have enclosed no photograph, for my face is plain and will not tell you what is in my heart. Luke had read her letter twice. The other replies he'd received were filled with flowery prose, feigned piety, and thinly veiled questions about the size of his ranch. Eliza's letter was different. It was raw, honest, and stripped of all pretense. Asterisk, a barren woman. The words were stark, but he had not asked for sons. He had asked for help. He already had a daughter who needed a mother. Perhaps a woman who could not have children of her own would treasure the one he already had. Her honesty appealed to his own blunt nature. She wasn't promising a future she couldn't deliver. She was offering exactly what he needed. His reply was brief. Asterisk, Miss Thompson, your honesty is appreciated. Your past is your own. I need a woman to help raise my daughter and run my home. You say you can do this, that is enough for me. Send word of which train you will be on. I will meet you at the station in Sandstone. And so it was settled. The transaction was complete. The train ride to Texas was a blur of rumbling wheels and endless, changing landscapes. With each mile that passed, Eliza felt a piece of her old life falling away, and a knot of equal parts hope and terror tightening in her stomach. She was traveling toward a man she'd never met, a child she didn't know, and a life she couldn't begin to imagine. Sandstone was little more than a dusty street baked into submission by the relentless sun. When Eliza stepped off the train, her simple gray dress already filmed with grit. The heat hit her like a physical blow. The platform was crowded with rough-looking men in worn denim and wide-brimmed hats, their faces tanned and lined. She clutched her small carpet bag and scanned the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw him almost immediately. He stood apart from the others, his height making him easy to spot. He was exactly as she had imagined from the tone of his letters, lean, hard, and unsmiling. His gaze met hers across the dusty expanse, and for a moment, the noise of the station faded away. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a cool, frank assessment. He was measuring her, she realized, just as he would a horse he was thinking of buying. He strode toward her, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. "Miss Thompson?" he asked, his voice a low baritone, rough around the edges like a frayed rope. "Mr. Callahan," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. He took her bag from her hand. The brief touch of his calloused fingers against hers sent a strange jolt through her. "The wagon's this way," he said, already turning. There was no smile, no word of welcome. As they walked toward a battered buckboard wagon hitched to two tired-looking horses, the whispers started. They were lower here, more guttural than the high-pitched gossip of the women in Harmony Creek, but just as cruel. "That him? Callahan," one man muttered to another. "Heard he was getting a mail order." "That's her," the other replied, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the hem of Eliza's dress. "Heard she's barren. Traded one empty womb for another. Seems like—" A flush of burning shame crawled up Eliza's neck. Her gaze flew to Luke, hoping for, what, a word of defense? A sharp glare to silence them? He gave no sign that he had heard. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed straight ahead as he tossed her bag into the back of the wagon and then moved to help her up onto the seat. His touch was impersonal, firm, and brief. The humiliation was a bitter pill to swallow. She had traveled 1,000 miles to escape the whispers, only to find they had followed her. Or perhaps, she thought with a sinking heart, they were simply waiting for her wherever she went. The ride to the Broken Horn Ranch was conducted in a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves. Luke Callahan did not speak. He kept his eyes on the dusty track ahead, his hands holding the reins with a practiced ease. Eliza sat stiffly beside him, her hands clenched in her lap, the scornful words from the station echoing in her mind. She had hoped for a new beginning, a clean slate. Instead, she had been branded before her feet had even touched the soil of her new home. She looked at the man beside her, at his hard profile and the grim set of his mouth. He had brought her here not as a wife, but as a necessity, a piece of equipment for his failing ranch. The cold distance he maintained was a wall, and she understood with a terrible clarity that she was on one side and he and his life were on the other. This was not a marriage, it was a contract, and her duties were about to begin. Life on the Broken Horn Ranch began before the sun. The first rooster's crow was a ragged tear in the pre-dawn silence, and in those early moments, a profound chill clung to the vast, open land. This was Eliza's new reality, a world dictated by the rising and setting of a relentless sun and the endless list of chores that filled the hours in between. The small ranch house, which Luke had built with his own hands for a wife now gone, became her domain. It was a sturdy, simple structure of cottonwood and sod, clean but stripped of all softness. The floors were bare wood. The furniture was functional and scarred, and every room seemed to hold the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke and sorrow. Eliza moved through this space with a quiet determination. She was not trying to erase the memory of Mary Callahan. She was simply trying to survive. She learned the quirks of the cast-iron stove, which demanded constant feeding and coaxing to produce an even heat. She hauled water from the deep well, her arms and back aching with the unfamiliar strain. She swept the fine red dust that seeped in through every crack, a battle she fought daily and never truly won. The land itself was a formidable opponent, The patch of earth behind the house that Mary had once called a garden was now a square of sun-baked clay, crisscrossed with deep cracks. The wind, a constant, sighing presence, blew hot and dry from the south, carrying with it the taste of grit and the scent of distant, dying things. The few horses that remained in the corral were listless. Their heads hung low, their ribs starkly visible beneath their dusty hides. The very landscape seemed to be gasping for breath. Yet, where Luke saw only decay, Eliza saw the faintest glimmer of a chance. She took a pickaxe to the hardened soil of the garden, her body screaming in protest, and broke it up, clod by stubborn clod. She hauled buckets of water, painstakingly rehydrating the parched earth, from a small cloth pouch in her luggage. She took a handful of hardy vegetable seeds, beans, squash, and corn that she had brought from the greener world she'd left behind. She planted them with a prayer, tending to the small plot as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Her days fell into a rhythm. She would rise, start the fire, and make coffee. She would cook a breakfast of bacon and biscuits, which Luke and Sarah would eat in near silence, while Luke rode out to mend fences or check on his dwindling herd. Eliza would tackle the house, the chickens, and her garden. In the afternoons, she turned her attention to Sarah. The child was like a small, wary ghost, flitting at the edges of Eliza's vision. For the first week, Sarah would not speak to her directly, answering any questions with a mute shake of her head and hiding behind her father's long legs whenever he was present. Her green eyes, so like the descriptions Eliza had heard of her mother's, were wide and assessing, missing nothing. Eliza knew she was being judged, and she understood the child's fear. She was the stranger who had taken her mother's place at the table, who slept in her mother's room. Eliza did not force the connection. She simply made herself a constant, gentle presence. She hummed old folk songs as she worked, the melodies soft and soothing in the quiet house. She baked a small batch of molasses cookies one afternoon, leaving them to cool on the windowsill, and watched from the corner of her eye as Sarah, after a long period of internal debate, crept over and snatched one, scurrying away like a squirrel with a nut. The breakthrough came one evening over a tattered rag doll named Lily. The doll's yarn hair was coming undone, and one of its button eyes was hanging by a thread. Sarah sat on the floor, her small face a mask of misery as she tried to fix it. Eliza, finished with the supper dishes, sat on the floor a few feet away. "She looks like she's had a bit of an adventure," Eliza said softly, not looking directly at the child. Sarah clutched the doll tighter. "My mother used to say a well-loved toy is one with plenty of scars to show for it." Eliza continued, "I have a needle and thread in my sewing box. The black thread would be just right for that eye. And I have some yellow yarn that's almost the same color as her hair." She didn't move, simply waited. After a long moment, Sarah pushed the doll across the floor toward her. Eliza spent the next hour carefully restitching the button eye, weaving new yarn hair into the doll's head, and mending a tear in its calico dress. When she was finished, she handed it back. Sarah took the doll, examining the repairs with a solemn intensity. Then, she looked up at Eliza, and for the first time, offered a small, hesitant smile. "Thank you," she whispered. From then on, a fragile bridge began to form between them. Eliza, who had been a teacher's assistant before her first marriage, began to teach Sarah her letters, drawing them with a stick in the dust outside the front door. She told her stories of faraway places, of mountains capped with snow and oceans so wide you couldn't see the other side. Slowly, the wary ghost began to transform back into a little girl. She started to chatter, to ask questions, and one afternoon, as they were feeding the chickens, she slipped her small hand into Eliza's. The warmth and trust in that simple gesture was so overwhelming that Eliza had to turn away to hide the tears that sprang to her eyes. Luke remained a distant, silent figure in this slowly changing world. He was a man who communicated through action, not words. He would eat the meals she prepared, wear the clothes she mended, and sleep in the bed she made. But he rarely looked at her, and his conversation was limited to the practical necessities of the ranch. The water barrel is low. We're almost out of flour. There's a storm coming from the north. He treated her like a hired hand, an efficient and capable assistant he had acquired to manage the domestic side of his life. He kept a careful distance, sleeping on the far edge of the bed, a chasm of cold sheets between them. Eliza understood. He was guarding the memory of his wife, protecting a heart that had already been shattered once. She did not push, did not ask for more than he was willing to give. She was grateful for the roof over her head and the purpose she found in her work. It was more than she'd had in Harmony Creek. But sometimes, she would catch him watching her. Once, he stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a long moment, his face unreadable, as he watched her show Sarah how to knead bread, their hands covered in flour. Another time, he came back to the house to find her sitting on the porch steps, singing softly to his daughter, her head bent over a book of fairy tales. He didn't say anything, just paused with his hand on the doorframe before turning and walking back toward the barn. But Eliza saw the flicker of something in his stormy eyes, not warmth, not yet, but a crack in the icy facade. It was a look of grudging respect, perhaps even a flicker of gratitude. The trips to the town of Sandstone for supplies were a necessary ordeal. It was there that the whispers of the train station solidified into a wall of open contempt. As they walked through the general store, the women of the town would stop their conversations, their eyes following Eliza with a mixture of pity and scorn. Their words were like stones, thrown from a safe distance. "That's her," a woman with a face like a dried apple whispered to her companion, just loud enough for Eliza to hear. "The barren one. Lord knows what Callahan was thinking. He needs sons to save that ranch, not another mouth to feed." "She's trying to grow a garden, I hear," the other snickered. "As if anything could grow for her. She'll drag him down to ruin. You mark my words." Eliza would flinch as if struck, her cheeks burning with a familiar, helpless shame. She would focus her gaze on her shopping list, her hands trembling slightly as she picked out flour and salt. Luke's reaction was always the same. His jaw would tighten, a muscle twitching in his cheek, and his face would become a thunderous mask. He wouldn't say a word in her defense. He would just conclude their business with grim efficiency, his movements sharp and angry, and herd her back to the wagon as quickly as possible. His silence was a shield, but it left her utterly exposed. One evening, the weight of it all became too much, after a particularly brutal trip to town, where even the store owner's wife had looked at her with unconcealed pity. Eliza felt something inside her break. After she had tucked Sarah into bed and the house had fallen quiet, she slipped out and went to the one place she felt she could be alone, the barn. The air inside was warm and smelled of hay and horses. She leaned against the rough wood of an empty stall, the sound of the animals' soft breathing a comforting rhythm in the darkness. And then she began to cry. Not loud, racking sobs, but silent, agonizing tears that streamed down her face, carrying with them 2 years of humiliation and a lifetime of thwarted hope. She cried for the husband who had discarded her, for the town that scorned her, and for the deep, aching emptiness in her womb that defined her in the eyes of the world. She cried for the cold, silent man she was married to, and for the fact that even here, 1,000 miles from home, she was still not enough. She didn't hear the soft crunch of boots on the hay-strewn floor. Luke had come to check on a mare that was due to foal soon. He stopped dead in the shadows of the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He saw her, her shoulders shaking, her face buried in her hands. He saw her profound, solitary grief. Every instinct told him to go to her, to offer something, but he didn't know what. The words wouldn't come. He was a stranger to comfort, and his own grief was a wall he could not seem to climb over. So he stood there for a long, silent moment, a witness to her pain, before quietly backing away, his own heart a tight, aching knot in his chest. Eliza never knew he had been there. She eventually dried her tears, splashed her face with water from the horse trough, and returned to the house. A fragile composure pieced back together. The next morning, Luke was gone before she woke. Propped up against the sugar bowl on the kitchen table was a piece of paper with his stark, angular handwriting on it. Asterisk Eliza, asterisk. Asterisk Henderson, the feed merchant, is coming by this morning. He is trying to sell me winter feed at a price that is too high. I will not be taken for a fool. I have to ride out to the North Range to check on the last of the herd. Deal with him. Do not let him cheat us. Asterisk L. Callahan asterisk. Eliza stared at the note, reading it 3 times. It was not an apology. It was not a word of comfort. But it was something more. It was trust. He was entrusting her with a crucial part of his ranch's survival, a negotiation he would always have handled himself. He had seen her at her most broken, and his response was not to pity her, but to give her power. He was telling her, in his own silent way, that he believed in her strength. A new resolve settled over her. She would not be defined by what she could not do, but by what she could. She would not be the town's barren bride. She would be the mistress of the broken horn. As she heard the rumble of a wagon approaching on the track, she smoothed her apron, lifted her chin, and walked out onto the porch to meet the feed merchant. She was no longer just a mail-order wife. She was becoming a pillar, and she would not let this ranch, or this family, fall. The summer heat arrived not as a gentle warming, but as a siege. It baked the land until the sparse grass turned the color of old straw and the creek bed fractured into a mosaic of dried mud. The sun was a merciless brass coin in a bleached blue sky, and the air grew thick with a fine dust that coated the back of the throat. Luke's face became a roadmap of anxiety, the lines around his eyes deepening as he watched his cattle grow thinner and the water level in the well drop lower with each passing day. The ranch was holding its breath, waiting for a rain that never came. Inside the small house, Eliza fought her own war against the encroaching desolation. She rationed water for her small, struggling garden, her beans and squash valiantly producing a meager crop that she guarded from grasshoppers and the punishing sun. She found a quiet rhythm with Sarah, their afternoons spent in the relative cool of the house, practicing letters on a small slate or reading from the one book of stories Eliza owned. The bond between them had blossomed into something natural and easy, a source of simple joy in a world that offered little of it. The fragile peace was shattered on an afternoon when the wind shifted, blowing hot and fierce from the west. Luke was at the small forge near the barn, trying to repair a broken plowshare. A stray spark, whipped by a sudden, violent gust, leaped from the anvil. It was a tiny, innocent thing, a speck of orange against the brown earth, but it landed on a pile of dry hay shavings, and in the space of a heartbeat, a small tendril of smoke became a hungry lick of flame. Eliza was shaking a rug out on the front porch when she smelled it, the sharp, acrid scent of trouble. She saw the smoke first, billowing from the side of the barn. But it wasn't the barn itself. It was the attached storeroom, the small, vital building that held their sacks of flour, beans, salted pork, and all the preserved goods meant to see them through the coming winter. "Luke!" she screamed, her voice thin against the wind. He had already seen it, dropping his hammer and running toward the well with a bucket. But the fire was moving with terrifying speed, feeding on the dry wood and the even drier contents within. It roared, a living, breathing monster. "Sarah!" Luke yelled, his face a mask of panic. "Where is Sarah?" Eliza's heart stopped. Sarah had been playing near the porch just moments before, chasing a stray barn kitten. Her eyes darted around the yard. The girl was nowhere in sight. A cold, sickening dread washed over Eliza as her gaze fixed on the open door of the storeroom. The kitten. Sarah had followed the kitten. There was no thought, only a primal scream in her soul that was Sarah's name. Before Luke could stop her, before she could even process the blistering heat rolling off the building in waves, Eliza ran. She pulled the hem of her apron up over her nose and mouth and plunged into the thick, choking smoke. Inside, it was a vision of hell. Flames clawed up the walls, and the air was a searing poison that burned her lungs. "Sarah!" she choked out, her eyes streaming. She heard a small, terrified whimper from the back corner. Behind a stack of barrels, the child was trapped, paralyzed by fear. Eliza scrambled toward her, the heat so intense it felt as if her skin was melting. She grabbed Sarah, pulling the child's face into her skirt. "We have to go, now!" As they turned, a burning beam from the ceiling cracked and gave way, crashing down in a shower of sparks and embers, blocking their path. Eliza didn't hesitate. She shoved Sarah ahead, toward a small gap near the wall, and shielded the child's body with her own as they scrambled through. Just as they cleared the doorway and tumbled out into the dusty yard, a piece of the flaming door frame broke loose, striking Eliza across her left forearm. She cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, but her arms never loosened their grip on Sarah. She rolled with the child, covering her completely until they were a safe distance away. Luke reached them a second later, his face pale with terror. He grabbed Sarah, his hands checking her frantically for injury. The child was coughing and crying, but unharmed. His wild, relieved eyes then fell on Eliza. She was trying to sit up, cradling her arm, her sleeve blackened and smoldering. A raw, angry burn stretched from her wrist to her elbow. The storeroom was a lost cause. Together, they worked with a desperate, synchronized fury, soaking blankets and beating back the flames that threatened to spread to the main barn. They fought until their muscles screamed and their lungs were raw, until finally, the fire was reduced to a smoldering, blackened ruin. That night, a different kind of quiet settled over the ranch. The smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. After a subdued supper, Eliza put a sleeping Sarah to bed. The child, exhausted from her ordeal, had clung to Eliza's side all evening. When Eliza returned to the main room, Luke was waiting. He had a bowl of cool water from the well and a small tin of salve. "Sit," he commanded, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. She obeyed, sitting in a straight-backed chair by the table. The throbbing in her arm had become a constant, searing pain. Wordlessly, he knelt before her. He took a pair of scissors and carefully cut away the burned fabric of her sleeve. His touch was surprisingly gentle as he cleansed the angry, blistered skin. He worked with a focused intensity, his brow furrowed. It was the closest he had ever been to her, the first time he had touched her with anything other than impersonal necessity. This was different. It was the touch of a man who had seen something precious nearly taken from him. As he smoothed the soothing salve over the burn, his thumb brushed against the inside of her wrist, and a shock, entirely separate from the pain, went through her. He wrapped her arm in clean strips of linen. When he was finished, he remained kneeling for a moment, his head bowed. "You saved her," he said, his voice thick. "It should have been me. I wasn't watching. You saved her." "She is my daughter, too," Eliza whispered, the words surprising her as much as they did him. He finally looked up, and in the soft, flickering glow of the oil lamp, she saw the walls in his stormy eyes crumble. She saw the fear, the gratitude, and the profound, aching weariness of a man who had been carrying the world alone for too long. He didn't return to his work. Instead, he took down the old, scuffed guitar that had been leaning in a corner of the room, untouched since she'd arrived. He sat in the chair opposite her, and after a moment of tuning the strings, he began to play. He was not a masterful musician, but he played with a raw, heartfelt simplicity. A sad, simple melody filled the small room, a lament for things lost, for hard times and broken dreams. They sat like that for a long time, The music a conversation between their two lonely souls. When the last note faded, the silence it left behind was not empty, but full of a new, fragile intimacy. "I still feel it, you know," Eliza said softly into the quiet. "The ache, wanting a child. When I first came here, I thought if I could just care for Sarah, it might be enough to fill that empty place, but it's not the same." She looked at her bandaged arm. "Today, when I ran into that fire, it wasn't a choice. It was just what I had to do. I love her, Luke, and loving her makes the ache even worse, because I know I will never feel a child of my own grow inside me." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She had not intended to confess this, to bear the deepest, most painful part of her soul to this silent, guarded man. But the fire and the music had stripped away their defenses. Luke stared at his hands, at the calluses and scars that told the story of his life. "Mary," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "She was everything. When she died, the world went cold. I thought it would be cold forever. I didn't want another wife. I didn't want another love. I just wanted someone to stop the silence." He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers. "When I look at you, when I see you with Sarah, when I eat the food you've cooked or see the life you're forcing out of that dead garden, the cold isn't so bad anymore." It was the most he had ever said to her, a confession more profound than any declaration of love. It was an admission of need, an acknowledgement of her place in his world. It was the truth. The tension that had been building between them for weeks finally snapped. A few nights later, Luke returned from a long ride, having spent the day assessing the full extent of the drought's damage. He carried a bottle of whiskey, and the weary slump of his shoulders told Eliza that the news was not good. He drank, not to get drunk, but to numb the edges of his despair. Eliza was in the small attic loft where they stored grain, checking for leaks. When he came up the ladder, he moved with an uncharacteristic unsteadiness, his face shadowed in the moonlight filtering through the single dusty window. He looked at her, his eyes full of a raw, desperate loneliness that mirrored her own. He reached out and tangled his fingers in her hair, pulling her gently toward him. His other hand came to rest on her waist. "Eliza," he breathed, his voice thick with whiskey and grief. It was the touch of a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. For a heart-stopping moment, she leaned into him, her body yearning for the comfort, for the connection, for the simple human warmth she had been denied for so long. His lips were close to hers, and she could feel the heat of his breath, the tremor in his hands. But then she saw the ghost in his eyes. It was not her that he was seeing, not fully. He was reaching for a memory, for the wife who had stood with him in this very spot, for the woman who had given him the child Eliza could not. She placed her hands gently on his chest and pushed him back. "No, Luke." His face clouded with confusion and rejection. "I will not be a ghost," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I will not be a replacement for what you have lost. When you touch me, I need it to be *me* that you are touching." The moment shattered. The raw emotion was replaced by a thick, awkward shame. He dropped his hands as if he'd been burned and turned away, descending the ladder without another word. For the next 2 days, the air in the house was brittle, heavy with unspoken words. They moved around each other like strangers, the easy rhythm they had found completely broken. Luke was colder, more distant than ever, and Eliza was consumed by the fear that she had destroyed the one fragile connection they had built. The bridge back to each other came, as it so often did, in the form of the small girl who unknowingly held their broken pieces together. Eliza was sitting by Sarah's bed long after the child had fallen asleep, mending a tear in her nightgown. The house was utterly still. In her sleep, Sarah stirred, a small frown creasing her brow as if from a bad dream. She turned over, her small hand reaching out as if searching for something. And then, in a voice thick with sleep, clear as a tiny bell in the silent house. She murmured one word, "Mama." The word struck Eliza with the force of a physical blow. It was the name she never thought she would hear, the title she never believed she would own. She looked over at the doorway. Luke was standing there, having come to check on his daughter. He had heard it too. His face was a canvas of shock, sorrow, and something else, something akin to wonder. Their eyes met over the sleeping child, and in that shared moment, the awkwardness and anger of the past 2 days dissolved. The word had recentered their world, reminding them both that a family was not just made of blood and birth, but of love, sacrifice, and the simple, profound act of being there. The shift in the house was as subtle as a change in the wind, but just as palpable. After the night Sarah had called her Mama in her sleep, the brittle tension between Luke and Eliza softened. They didn't speak of the moment in the attic, nor of the one in the bedroom doorway, but an unspoken truce settled between them. They had found a common ground in their shared love for the child, a small, safe island in the turbulent sea of their arrangement. Luke's eyes would sometimes linger on Eliza for a moment longer than necessary, and a hesitant warmth began to thaw the ice in their stormy depths. It was this fragile new peace that prompted him, one cool morning in early autumn, to make an unprecedented suggestion. "The town is holding its harvest festival on Saturday," he said, his gaze fixed on the coffee cup in his hands. "They do it every year. Music, food. Sarah would like the games." Eliza paused, her hands still in the dishwater. The thought of going into Sandstone for anything other than the bare necessities sent a familiar chill of dread through her. The festival would be the entire town gathered in one place, a concentrated dose of the whispers and stares she had learned to endure. "I don't know. Luke, there's so much to be done here." "The chores can wait a day," he said, finally looking at her. "I want you to come, with us." The meaning was clear. He wasn't just taking his daughter to a festival. He was taking his family. He was, for the first time, publicly presenting them as a unit. It was a terrifying and heart-stoppingly hopeful proposition. To refuse would be to reject the first real branch he had extended to her. Swallowing her fear, she nodded. "All right. Luke, we'll go." On Saturday, a nervous energy filled the small house. Eliza helped Sarah into her best dress, a simple blue calico that she had painstakingly mended and washed. She brushed the child's fiery red hair until it shone, tying it back with a matching blue ribbon. For herself, she chose her plainest gray dress, the one she felt most invisible in, but she pinned a small, wild prairie rose she'd found growing near the creek to the collar, a tiny act of defiance. When she came out, Luke was waiting by the wagon. He had slicked his dark hair back with water and was wearing a clean, faded shirt. He stopped when he saw her, his eyes taking in the sight of her and his daughter. A rare, small smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You both look nice," he said, the compliment sounding rusty and unfamiliar on his tongue. The festival was a riot of noise and color. Fiddles played a lively tune. The air was thick with the smell of roasting pork and sweet apple pies, and the main street was crowded with families. For a little while, Eliza allowed herself to believe it might be all right. Sarah's face was alight with wonder. Luke won her a small wooden bird at a ring toss game, and the child's delighted laughter was a sound so pure it made Eliza's heart ache. He bought them all lemonade, and as they stood watching a group of men engage in a tug-of-war, his arm brushed against hers, a casual contact that felt anything but. The illusion shattered when they approached the long tables laden with food, where the women of the town had gathered to serve the potluck meal and trade gossip. As Eliza stepped forward, a silence fell over the group closest to her. It was Mrs. Gable, the hawk-faced woman from the general store, who spoke first. "Well, look here," she said, her voice carrying in the sudden lull. "It's the Callahan's new housekeeper." The emphasis was a deliberate insult. Another woman, stout and florid-faced, chimed in with a cruel titter. I hear she's working wonders on that tired old ranch. It's a shame she can't work the same magic on a fallow field. She looked pointedly at Eliza's flat stomach. Some ground is just too barren to plow. The laughter that followed was quiet, but it was like a physical blow. Hot, suffocating shame washed over Eliza. She froze, the plate in her hand trembling, the lively music and happy shouts of the festival fading into a dull roar in her ears. She wanted to turn and run, to disappear into the dust. Before she could move, Luke stepped in front of her, his body a sudden, hard shield, his face, which had been relaxed and almost happy moments before, was now a thundercloud. His stormy eyes locked onto the women. "You will not speak to my wife that way," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that cut through the chatter. The women recoiled, surprised by his venom, but a man standing nearby, his face flushed with drink, swaggered forward. "Easy there, Callahan," he slurred, clapping a hand on Luke's shoulder. "The ladies are just having a bit of fun. No harm in stating the facts, is there? A man needs heirs to carry on his name." It happened in an instant. Luke shrugged the hand off as if it were a snake. He grabbed the front of the man's shirt, his knuckles white, and shoved him back against a wagon wheel. "The next man who speaks of my wife's honor, or lack thereof, will be picking his teeth up from the dirt. Do you understand me?" His voice was lethally quiet, more frightening than any shout. The man, his drunken courage evaporating, nodded frantically, his eyes wide with fear. Luke released him, his chest heaving. The entire area had fallen silent, all eyes on them. He turned, his face still a mask of cold fury, and took Eliza's arm. "We're leaving." He strode through the crowd, pulling her along, with a bewildered Sarah trotting to keep up. He didn't stop until they reached their wagon on the edge of town. He lifted Sarah into the back and helped Eliza onto the seat, all with the same grim, silent rage. The ride home began in a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than any they had ever shared. The festive sounds faded behind them, replaced by the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves on the dry road. Eliza stared straight ahead. The women's laughter and the man's leering face burned into her mind. She was the source of this ugliness. She was the reason for Luke's public humiliation. "I am sorry, Luke," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't look at her. "It wasn't your fault." "But it was," she insisted, tears welling in her eyes. "It will always be my fault. They will never stop. I see the way they look at you, the pity. They think you made a fool's bargain. And today I made you a spectacle. I won't do that to you." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "When we get back to the ranch, I will pack my things. You can tell them you sent me away. You can find someone else, someone whole." "Be quiet, Eliza," he said, his voice rough. "No, I won't be quiet," she cried, the words tumbling out in a torrent of pain. "You deserve a wife who can give you sons, who can stand beside you with pride, not one who brings you shame at a town festival. I won't be the stone that drowns you." "Luke!" He finally turned to look at her, his face a mixture of anger and a raw emotion she couldn't decipher. "I said—" He never finished the sentence. The sky, which had been clear an hour before, had turned a bruised, menacing purple on the western horizon. A sudden, violent gust of wind tore at the wagon's canvas cover, and the temperature dropped. The horses, sensing the change, grew skittish, their ears twitching. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Within minutes, the storm was upon them. The sky opened up, and rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets. The dusty road turned instantly to a slick, treacherous mud. A bolt of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. The horses panicked. They reared, screaming, their eyes wide with terror. Luke fought with the reins, his muscles straining, but the wagon lurched violently and slid off the track. the right wheel catching in a deep rut and snapping with a sound like a gunshot. They were thrown clear. Luke managed to hold on to Sarah, rolling to protect her, while Eliza landed hard in the mud, the breath knocked out of her. The terrified horses, free from the broken wagon, galloped off into the blinding rain. Luke was at her side in a second. "Are you hurt?" "No," she gasped, pushing herself up, soaked and shivering. "I'm all right." They were stranded, miles from home in the middle of a torrential storm. Luke scanned the bleak landscape. Through the sheets of rain, he spotted a dark shape on a low rise, an old line shack, abandoned and likely derelict, but it was shelter. "Come on," he yelled over the wind. "This way!" He half-carried, half-dragged Sarah, while holding fast to Eliza's hand, and they struggled up the muddy slope to the shack. The door hung on one hinge, but the roof, miraculously, seemed mostly intact. Inside, it was dark and smelled of dust, decay, and damp earth, but it was dry. Eliza collapsed against a wall, shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. The thin gray dress was plastered to her skin, offering no protection from the bone-deep chill. Sarah, wrapped in Luke's arms, was crying softly. Luke settled the child in a corner on a pile of old, dry sacks, murmuring soothing words to her until her sobs quieted into exhausted sleep. Then he turned to Eliza. She was huddled into a ball, her arms wrapped around herself, shaking violently. Without a word, he stripped off his heavy, drenched coat. Then he began to unbutton his shirt. It was damp, but the thick flannel held his body heat. He knelt in front of her and wrapped the shirt around her narrow shoulders, pulling her against his chest. The warmth of him was a shock. It seeped through her wet dress, solid and real and comforting. He held her, his arms strong and sure, tucking her head under his chin. He smelled of rain, leather, and the faint, clean scent of soap. The storm raged outside, the wind howling around the corners of the shack and the thunder booming, but inside their small, dark shelter, there was only the sound of their breathing and the frantic beating of Eliza's heart. The distance between them, the walls of grief and duty and shame, had been washed away by the rain. He tilted her chin up, his face a shadow in the gloom. He was looking at her, really looking at her, and in his eyes she saw none of the anger from the festival, none of the cold distance from their first meeting. She saw only a deep, profound tenderness and a hunger that mirrored her own. It was not a sudden, passionate crash, but a slow, inevitable tide. He lowered his head and his lips met hers. The kiss was hesitant at first, a question. Then, as she responded, her cold lips warming against his, it deepened. It was a kiss that spoke of shared loneliness, of gratitude, of the desperate, aching need to be seen and to belong. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and redemption. His hands moved from her shoulders to her face, his calloused thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. She brought her own trembling hands up to his chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her palms. There, in the heart of the storm, with the world stripped away to its most elemental forces, they came together. It was not a taking, but a giving. It was a slow, deliberate unwrapping of two guarded souls, a silent, desperate confession of want and need. In that abandoned shack, surrounded by darkness and the fury of the storm, Eliza Callahan finally felt like she had come home. The storm passed before dawn, as the first pale gray light filtered through the cracks in the walls. Eliza lay awake in the circle of Luke's arms, listening to his steady breathing. The world felt new, washed clean. The intimacy they had shared was a profound, life-altering thing, but as the reality of the morning crept in, so did the old, familiar ache of her own inadequacy. She had given him her body, her heart, but the one thing a wife was meant to give her husband, the one thing the world valued above all else, was still beyond her. This new precious connection only made her failure feel more acute. How could she truly be his wife, his partner, if she could not give him a child, an heir for the ranch he fought so hard to save? The joy of the night was tinged with the bitter taste of a new, more painful despair. When they finally returned to the ranch later that day, weary and mud-stained, something had irrevocably shifted. The silence was no longer heavy with unspoken tension, but with a quiet, shared understanding. And that night, as they lay together in the bed that had once been a cold, divided space, Eliza felt Luke stir beside her. He rolled onto his side, and in the darkness, she felt the gentle, hesitant weight of his hand come to rest on her lower abdomen. It was not a gesture of demand or expectation. It was a touch filled with a quiet, fragile hope, a silent prayer laid upon the very place she considered her greatest failure, claiming it, and her, as his own. The night of the storm was a baptism, washing away the last vestiges of the contract that had brought them together. In its place, something new and vital began to grow. The Broken Horn Ranch, once a place of silent grief and encroaching decay, started to breathe again. The change was slow at first, then all at once. The rains that had nearly destroyed them had also been a blessing, breaking the drought and turning the parched plains a tentative, hopeful green. Eliza, imbued with a new sense of belonging, poured her heart into the land, her garden. Once a desperate, hard-won patch, now overflowed with plump squash, sturdy beans, and tall stalks of corn. She found a flock of scrawny but resilient hens for sale in a neighboring county, and soon the ranch had a steady supply of fresh eggs. She organized the root cellar, mended the leaking roof of the chicken coop, and filled the house with the smells of baking bread and simmering stew. She brought order and life to every corner she touched. The most profound change, however, was in Luke. The hard, silent shell he had inhabited for years began to crack and fall away. One morning, Eliza came outside to see him staring at the charred ruins of the old storeroom. But for the first time, there was not despair in his eyes, but calculation. That afternoon, he began clearing the debris. The next day, he started laying the foundation for a new, larger stable. The steady, rhythmic sound of his hammer became the ranch's new heartbeat, a sound of construction, of future, of faith. He started to smile, not often, but when he did, it transformed his rugged face, chasing the shadows from his eyes. He would watch Sarah and Eliza in the garden, a quiet contentment settling over him. He started talking, sharing small details of his day, asking her opinion on the new stable's design, or pointing out a hawk circling in the vast sky. The space between them in the bed at night was no longer a chasm, but a warm, shared sanctuary. His hand on her stomach became a familiar, comforting ritual, a silent testament to the new life they were building, a quiet hope for a life that might yet be created. This new, vibrant energy did not go unnoticed. On their next trip to Sandstone for supplies, the atmosphere was entirely different. The whispers and scorn were gone, replaced by looks of curious, speculative respect. The change was led, to Eliza's astonishment, by Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Callahan," the woman said, her voice dripping with a honeyed sweetness that was far more unnerving than her previous acid tones. She bustled forward, holding out a jar of peach preserves. "You're looking radiant. Country life certainly agrees with you." Her eyes dropped meaningfully to Eliza's waistline for a fraction of a second before meeting her gaze again. The rumor had started, as they often do, from a single misplaced observation. Eliza, feeling a touch of dizziness from the early morning heat a few weeks prior, had leaned against a post in town for a moment to steady herself. It was all the kindling the town's gossips needed. Now, seeing her with a healthy color in her cheeks, her face softened by a quiet happiness, they fanned the spark into a flame. Eliza Callahan was with child. Suddenly, She was no longer the barren bride. She was a woman on the cusp of fulfilling her sacred duty. People smiled at her in the street. The blacksmith offered Luke a favorable price on iron hinges. Women who had once mocked her now offered unsolicited advice on pregnancy and childbirth. The town's approval was a warm, intoxicating blanket, but Eliza felt a chill beneath it. Their acceptance was conditional, a prize she had not yet earned, based on a truth she did not know. The hope, however, was a treacherous seed planted in her own heart. Could it be true? She had been so certain, for so long, that her body was a closed and barren place. But since the storm, since Luke had truly become her husband, a fragile, terrifying hope had taken root. She would wake in the morning with a bout of nausea, which she attributed to nerves, but now wondered if it could be something more. She had to know. She couldn't bear this tightrope walk between hope and her old, familiar despair. She couldn't bear the look in Luke's eyes, a look that was beginning to mirror the town's hopeful speculation. One Tuesday, feigning a need for special sewing thread she could only get in the larger town of Redemption, 20 miles to the east, she made the journey alone. Her true destination was the small, clapboard office of Dr. Adams, a kind, elderly physician with gentle eyes and knowing hands. He listened patiently to her story, his face giving nothing away. He performed his examination in a quiet, professional manner. When he was finished, he bid her to sit and washed his hands in a porcelain basin. The silence in the small, clean room stretched for an eternity, filled only by the ticking of a clock on the wall, each tick a hammer blow against Eliza's heart. "Well, Mrs. Callahan," he began, his voice soft, "you are not with child." The words were gentle, but they landed with the force of a physical assault. The air rushed from Eliza's lungs. The ticking of the clock grew louder, a deafening roar. "I am sorry," he continued, seeing the devastation on her face. "From my examination, it appears you suffered a severe fever at some point in your youth. Is that right?" Eliza nodded numbly, remembering the scarlet fever that had nearly taken her at age 12. "It can happen sometimes," the doctor explained. "The fever leaves a scarring. A delicate system is made inhospitable. It is not your fault. It is simply the way your body has healed." He paused, then delivered the final, crushing blow. "It would take a miracle for you to conceive, Mrs. Callahan. I believe it is best for you to accept that it is not God's plan for you." The journey back to the broken horn was a blur of dust and sorrow. Eliza held the reins, her body performing the familiar task automatically, while her mind reeled. The fragile blossom of hope had been ripped out by the roots, leaving a raw, bleeding wound. She was the same as she had always been, barren, a fallow field. The town's brief, conditional acceptance was a lie, and soon they would know it. But the most agonizing thought was of Luke. He was a man reborn, building a future with his own two hands, and she knew that a part of that future, a large part of his newfound hope, was the idea of a son, a child to carry on his name, to work the land beside him, to fill the quiet corners of the house with laughter. How could she tell him? How could she be the one to extinguish the light that had just begun to shine in his eyes? She couldn't, not yet. She would let him have his hope, his dream, for a little while longer. It was a cruel deception, a lie of omission, but it felt like the only kindness she had left to give. She rode back onto the ranch and forced a smile. She showed him the thread she'd bought, told him about her day, and deflected his questions with practiced ease. But something inside her had shuddered. The light in her own eyes dimmed. When Luke would reach for her at night, his hand settling on her stomach with that now familiar gesture of gentle hope, it felt like a brand. She would flinch, her body stiffening at the lie his touch represented. She began to pull away, creating a small, imperceptible distance between them, an island of her own misery. Luke, confused by her sudden coolness, attributed it to a woman's moods. But the distance grew. The catalyst for the crisis arrived a week later in a smart, polished buggy. A stark contrast to the weathered buckboards of their neighbors. The woman who stepped down was pretty, with confident blue eyes and auburn hair pinned in a fashionable style. She wore a dress of expensive blue wool, and she moved with an air of entitled ownership, as if she were surveying a property she was considering buying. She introduced herself as Clara May Thornton, a widow from a neighboring county. She was an old acquaintance of Luke's, she explained, from before he had even met Mary. Eliza's heart sank. This woman represented a past, a different path Luke's life could have taken. Clara May's eyes swept over Eliza, a flicker of dismissive pity in her gaze, before she turned her full attention to Luke. "Luke, it is so good to see you looking well," she cooed. "And I heard the most wonderful news in town. A baby. I'm so thrilled for you." "We have no news to share, Clara," Luke said, his voice flat and guarded. "Oh, of course. Keeping it quiet for now," she said with a knowing little laugh. But then her expression turned serious, a mask of cloying sympathy. "But Luke, I know these things can be uncertain, and I came here to say that if, for any reason, the rumors aren't true, well, you know my situation. I have my own son, of course, but my late husband's ranch is secure, and I've always been fond of you." She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "A man like you, a man with a legacy to build. He needs sons. I just want you to know I can give you that, a real family." The offer hung in the air, brazen and poisonous. It was a direct assault, a deliberate attempt to wedge herself into the one crack in Eliza's existence. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. She felt dizzy, exposed, as if Clara May had ripped open her dress and pointed a finger at her barren womb for all the world to see. Luke's reaction was instantaneous and volcanic. The friendly acquaintance was gone, replaced by the hard, dangerous man from the Harvest Festival. "Clara," he said, his voice lethally soft, "you will get in your buggy, you will turn it around, and you will get off my land, and if you ever speak to me or my wife again, you will regret it." Clara May's confident smile faltered. She saw the implacable fury in his eyes and took a hasty step back. "I was only trying to help," she stammered. "Get out," he repeated, his voice like the crack of a whip. She scrambled into her buggy and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and a thick, toxic silence in her wake. Luke stood watching her go, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was breathing heavily, his entire body radiating a protective rage that was wholly for Eliza. But when he finally turned to look at her, the anger in his eyes was mingled with a new, sharp suspicion. He had seen the look on Eliza's face when Clara made her offer, not just shock, but a flash of raw, unbearable pain. He connected it instantly to the distance she had kept from him for the past week. That night, the confrontation he had been avoiding finally came, in the small, quiet space of their bedroom, with the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He turned to her. "What was that today, Eliza?" "She was a cruel woman. It was nothing," Eliza murmured, turning away to unpin her hair. "It wasn't nothing," he said, his voice hard. He crossed the room and took her by the shoulders, forcing her to face him. "For the past week, you have looked at me like I'm a stranger. You pull away when I touch you, and then that woman shows up, speaks of a child, and your face. It was a look of pure misery. What is it you're not telling me? Are you unhappy here? Do you want to leave?" His accusation, so far from the truth, was the final straw. The dam of her control, so carefully constructed, finally broke. A choked sob escaped her lips, and then another. The whole story came tumbling out in a torrent of gasping, hiccuping grief. "I went to redemption," she cried, the tears streaming down her face. "I saw a doctor. There is no baby. Luke, there will never be a baby. He told me. He said it would be a miracle." She told him everything: the scarlet fever, the scarring, the final, hopeless diagnosis. She confessed why she had kept it from him, why she had pulled away. "I couldn't bear it," she wept, her body shaking. "I couldn't take your hope away. Every time you touched me, I felt like such a liar, such a fraud." She finally sagged against him, her grief spent, leaving her empty and hollow. She looked up at his face, searching for the anger, the pity, the disappointment she was so sure she would find there. "I am sorry, Luke," she whispered, her voice raw. "I am so sorry I am not what you need." She took a steadying breath, preparing to give him the only thing she had left to offer, his freedom. That woman today, what she said was vile, but the idea, it wasn't wrong. You deserve a real family. You deserve sons. You have the right to choose someone else, someone who can give you everything. Eliza's words hung in the small room, stark and final. She offered him his freedom, and in doing so, laid her own heart on an altar for him to take or to break. She expected him to be disappointed, perhaps even quietly relieved. She did not expect the fury that blazed in his eyes. It was not an anger directed at her, but at the world, at the cruel twist of fate, at the very idea that their fragile happiness could be reduced to a biological transaction. He looked at her, at the raw, self-sacrificing pain on her face, and saw the cage she had been locked in her whole life. And he saw the hope he himself had foolishly clung to, the unspoken dream of another child, and felt a hot, bitter shame. He had allowed that dream to become a part of their foundation, and now that it was gone, the whole structure was collapsing. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The words were a tangled, angry knot in his throat. To stay would be to say something he would regret, to see the pain he was causing her. To argue would be to give voice to a disappointment he couldn't deny feeling, which would only twist the knife in her heart. So he did the only thing a man cornered by his own emotions could do. He turned, strode out of the room, and slammed the front door behind him with a crack that echoed the shattering of Eliza's world. A moment later, she heard the frantic thud of a horse's hooves, galloping away into the unforgiving darkness of the plains. He was gone. The silence he left behind was a living thing, vast and suffocating. For a long while, Eliza did not move. She stood in the center of the room, a statue carved from grief. It was over. She had offered him an escape, and he had taken it. The warmth, the music, the shared glances, the feeling of his hand on her stomach in the dark. It had all been a beautiful, fleeting mirage in the desert of her life. Now, the desert had reclaimed her. There were no more tears. She was hollowed out, an empty vessel, with a slow, mechanical numbness. She went to the small wardrobe and took out her old carpet bag. Her movements were precise, devoid of emotion. She folded her few dresses, the plain gray one she'd arrived in, the slightly nicer one she had worn to the festival. Each fold was a final farewell. She wrapped her brush and comb in a cloth. There was so little to pack. Her entire existence on this ranch, the life that had felt so full and real, could be contained in one small, worn bag. She would leave in the morning. She would not be a burden, a ghost haunting the corners of his life. She would walk to Sandstone and use the last of her meager savings to buy a ticket on the first train heading east, back toward a world of whispers and pity. But it was the only world she knew. She was placing her mother's tarnished silver locket into the bag when a sound from the other room broke through her trance. It was a small, fretful cough. "Sarah!" Eliza's own sorrow was instantly forgotten. She went to the child's bedside. Sarah was tossing in her sleep, her cheeks flushed a feverish red, her breathing shallow and ragged. When Eliza laid a hand on her forehead, she recoiled from the heat. The child was burning up. It wasn't just a cold, it was a deep, dangerous fever that seemed to have come from nowhere. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Eliza's numb grief. Luke was gone. She was miles from town. With no horse and no way to get help, the night pressed in on all sides, vast and indifferent. It was just her and the sick child. Her own plans to leave evaporated like mist. Her world, which had collapsed moments before, now shrank to the four walls of this small room and the tiny, struggling life within it. The next 3 days blurred into a single, continuous loop of fear and duty. The fever would not break. Sarah drifted in and out of a restless, delirious sleep, her small body racked with shivers one moment and radiating a frightening heat the next. She would cry out for her father, for her mother, her small pleas tearing at Eliza's heart. Eliza did not sleep. She did not stop. She became a fierce, tireless guardian. She remembered the folk remedies her own grandmother had used, the practical knowledge of women who lived and died far from any doctor. She kept a constant supply of cool cloths on Sarah's forehead, changing them the moment they grew warm. She brewed a bitter tea from willow bark, which she'd seen growing by the creek, and patiently, persistently, spooned the liquid past the child's dry, cracked lips. She made thin, nourishing broths from their dwindling supply of salted chicken, whispering words of encouragement, of love, of hope, even when the child was too lost in the fever to hear. She sat through the long, dark nights, the only light from a single flickering lamp, her hand never leaving Sarah's. She would sponge the child's hot skin, murmur soft lullabies, and pray with a fervor she hadn't felt in years. In this waking nightmare, she was not Luke Callahan's barren wife or the town's object of scorn. She was a mother, fighting a desperate battle for her child's life with the only weapons she had, her hands, her knowledge, and a love so powerful it left no room for her own exhaustion or despair. On the third evening, Luke returned. He had ridden for 2 days, aimless and furious, trying to outrun the storm in his own soul. He had wrestled with his anger, his disappointment, and the undeniable, gut-wrenching truth that he loved Eliza. He had raged at God for giving him this one good thing, only to reveal its one tragic flaw. But the longer he was away, the more the anger faded, replaced by a hollow, aching loneliness. The silence of the plains was nothing compared to the silence of a house without her in it. He didn't have an answer. He didn't know what their future looked like. He only knew he could not live without her. He turned his horse around and rode home, a man surrendering to his own heart. He expected to find the house cold and empty. He expected to find her gone. The dread of it had been a stone in his gut for the last 50 miles. When he pushed open the door, he was met with a strange scene. The house was dim, the air thick with the smell of sickness and herbs. And in the center of the room, in the rocking chair, sat Eliza. She was a ghost of the woman he had left. Her face was pale and drawn, with dark, bruised circles under her eyes. Her hair had come loose from its pins and fell in tangled strands around her shoulders. Her dress was rumpled and stained. In her arms, wrapped in a thick quilt, was Sarah. The child was asleep, her breathing still raspy but more even, a faint sheen of sweat on her brow. The fever had finally broken. Eliza was rocking slowly, her eyes closed, her body swaying with a weariness so profound it seemed to be the only thing holding her upright. She looked up as he entered, and her eyes were not angry or accusatory. They were simply exhausted, but they held a fierce, protective fire. He stood frozen in the doorway. Taking in the scene, he saw the basin of water, the pile of used cloths, the cup of herbal tea on the table. He saw the evidence of a long and desperate siege. He saw a woman who had been abandoned, who believed her life was over, but who had not for 1 second abandoned her duty, her love. And in that moment, a profound, shattering understanding washed over him. He had been a fool, a blind, selfish fool. He had been mourning the loss of a hypothetical son, a ghost child he had dreamed up. While this woman, this incredible, strong, loving woman, had been here all along. being a mother in every way that truly mattered. She had run into a burning building for his daughter. She had stood against the scorn of an entire town for his family. And she had sat in this chair for 3 days and nights, without sleep, and wrestled his child back from the jaws of death. Motherhood wasn't a biological fact. It was an act of relentless, sacrificial love. It was a choice you made every day, in 1,000 small and large ways. Eliza had been making that choice since the day she arrived. The anger and disappointment he had felt vanished, replaced by a wave of shame and an overwhelming, heart-crushing love. He slowly crossed the room, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He didn't stop until he was standing before her. Then, this tall, proud man, who had never bent his knee to anyone, slowly sank to the floor in front of her chair. He knelt in the dust. "Eliza," he said, his voice thick and broken. He reached out and took her free hand, the one that wasn't holding Sarah. It was cold and limp. He brought it to his lips. "I am so sorry." She just looked at him, too tired to speak. "I left because I was a coward," he continued, his eyes locked on hers. "I was angry at myself for hoping. I was angry at the world, but I was never, not for 1 second, angry at you." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "When I wrote to that newspaper, I said I needed a partner. When I met you at the train, I treated you like a hired hand. When I brought you into my bed, I was a lonely, grieving man. But I was wrong about what I needed, and I was wrong about what I was getting." He looked from her face to the sleeping child in her arms. "That woman, Clara, she offered to give me a child. But you have already given me back mine. You have given her a mother. You have given me a home." He tightened his grip on her hand. "The first time I asked you to be my wife, it was a contract, a bargain. I am asking again, Eliza, not because I need a helper, not because I want a son, but because I love you, because you are the strongest, bravest, best woman I have ever known. Will you be my wife? Truly. Will you let me be your husband?" A single tear escaped Eliza's eye and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. They were not the tears of sorrow she had wept in the barn, nor the tears of humiliation from the festival. They were tears of absolution. She looked at this man kneeling before her, and for the first time, she felt truly seen. He wasn't seeing a barren womb or a broken woman. He was seeing her. A week later, they stood on the front porch of the ranch house. The circuit preacher, a kindly man with a weathered face, stood before them. Sarah, fully recovered and wearing the blue dress with the ribbon, stood beside Eliza, clutching her hand, as witnesses. They had only 2 of their neighbors, the blacksmith and his wife, a quiet couple who had always offered a nod instead of a whisper, and who had come with a freshly baked apple pie as a wedding gift. The preacher's words were simple. The promises they made were the same ones they had already been living. When Luke slid a plain, slender gold band, his own mother's, onto Eliza's finger, she began to cry. She cried as he lifted her chin and kissed her. A real kiss, full of love and promise, in the bright light of day. She was not crying because she had finally found happiness. She was crying because, for the first time in her life, she had been chosen, not for what her body could produce, but for who her soul already was. She was not a fallow field. She was not a failure. She was simply Eliza. And for the first time, in the eyes of the man she loved, that was more than enough. Their second wedding was not a contract, but a covenant, and it remade the world of the Broken Horn Ranch. The change was not in the land itself, which was already responding to the rain and their hard work, but in its spirit. The invisible walls Luke had built around his property, the ones meant to keep the world out, dissolved. The ranch, once a fortress of grief, slowly, organically, became a sanctuary. It began with a single family, the Millers, whose small homestead 50 miles south had been foreclosed upon by the bank. They were heading north with no destination, their few belongings piled in a rickshaw they pulled by hand. Luke found them on the road, their children's faces pale with hunger, and without hesitation, he brought them home. Eliza set 2 more places at the table, then 3 more. They stayed for a week in the new, spacious barn, helping with chores in exchange for food and shelter. And when they left, their wagon was stocked with flour, salted pork, and a dozen of Eliza's eggs. Word of the Callahans' kindness traveled on the wind, a quiet rumor that was the very opposite of the vicious gossip that had once plagued Eliza. Soon, others found their way to the ranch, a widower whose wife had died in childbirth, left with a babe in arms and no idea how to care for it, an elderly couple who had lost their savings to a traveling charlatan, a young boy who had run away from an abusive apprenticeship in a town far to the east. The Broken Horn became a place where the broken could find a moment of peace, a warm meal, and a gentle hand to help them back on their feet. Eliza was the heart of this burgeoning community. Her days were a whirlwind of activity, but it was a joyful, purposeful chaos. In the mornings, she would gather the children, Sarah, the Miller boys when they were there, the runaway lad named Timothy, on the front porch for lessons, with a large piece of slate propped on an easel Luke had built for her. She taught them their letters and numbers, her voice patient and calm. She taught them not just to read words, but to find stories in the clouds and lessons in the resilience of the prairie grass. Her small vegetable patch expanded, and beside it, she cultivated a new garden, one filled with herbs whose uses she'd learned from a tattered almanac and her own grandmother's wisdom. There was yarrow and chamomile for fevers, comfrey for poultices, lavender for calming restless sleepers, and echinacea to ward off sickness. The women who passed through, tired and worn, would often find a cup of her soothing tea pressed into their hands. The ranch smelled not of dust and despair, but of baking bread, simmering herbs, and clean laundry drying in the sun. Her new role was cemented one autumn afternoon when a young woman, barely 17, arrived on foot. Her name was Sadie. She was gaunt and terrified, with haunted eyes and a secret she carried shamefully under her worn dress. She had been working as a serving girl in a saloon in a rough railroad town and was now pregnant and cast out. The story of what had happened to her was told in broken whispers to Eliza late one night, a tale of cruelty and male aggression that made Eliza's heart ache with a cold, protective fury. While some of the other ranch hands and visitors looked at the girl with suspicion, Eliza saw only a terrified child. She took Sadie under her wing, giving her a small room in the house, ensuring she ate, and protecting her from prying questions. As Sadie's time grew near, her terror mounted. "I can't do it, Mrs. Callahan." She would weep. "I don't know how. I ain't a mother." "Hush now," Eliza would soothe, stroking the girl's hair. "Being a mother isn't about knowing how. It's about being there, and I will be right here with you." When the labor began, it was long and difficult. There was no time to fetch a doctor. With the knowledge gleaned from the blacksmith's wife and her own steady intuition, Eliza took charge. She was a calming presence in the storm of Sadie's pain, her voice a low, steady anchor. She held the girl's hand, wiped her brow, and breathed with her through the worst of it. When the final moment came, it was Eliza's hands, sure and gentle, that brought the new life into the world. A tiny, wailing baby girl, as she cleaned the infant and wrapped her in a soft blanket, placing her in Sadie's trembling arms. A profound, holy quiet filled the room. Sadie looked from her daughter's face to Eliza's, her eyes filled with a dawning, tearful wonder. "You saved us," she whispered. The story spread through the small community and eventually trickled into Sandstone. They gave her a new name then. She was no longer the barren bride. Now, whispered with a kind of awe, she was the childless midwife, a woman who, despite her own empty womb, could shepherd new life into the world with a skill and grace that was a marvel. The title, which might have seemed cruel to an outsider, was a badge of the highest honor to Eliza. It was an acknowledgement of a different kind of motherhood, one of spirit, not of flesh. Luke watched his wife's transformation with a quiet, powerful pride. His love for her was a constant, steady flame that warmed his entire world. The ranch was thriving. With the help of the men he'd given shelter, his herds were growing, and his lands were more productive than they had ever been under his father. One day, he came home from a trip to the county seat, his eyes shining with a secret. He took Eliza by the hand and led her to the top of a small rise that overlooked the western pastures. The land rolled out before them, a sea of green grass under the vast Texas sky. "I bought it," he said simply. "The whole section, from here to the river bend." Eliza gasped. It was a huge parcel of land, far more than they needed. "Luke, how?" "We're doing well," he said with a shrug, though his smile betrayed his pride. "And I wanted to name it. It's not the Broken Horn. It's separate." He squeezed her hand, his gaze soft as he looked at her. "It's called Eliza's Meadow, because you are the one who made all this grow again." They stood there for a long time, the wind in their hair, their hands clasped together. In that moment, looking out over the land that bore her name, Eliza felt a sense of peace and wholeness so profound. She thought her heart might burst. The old ache, the hollow longing that had defined her for so long, was gone. She was rooted here, in this land, with this man, surrounded by a family she had built not from blood, but from love. The seasons turned. A gentle winter gave way to a vibrant, glorious spring. The wildflowers exploded across Eliza's meadow, painting it in strokes of blue, yellow, and red. The days were warm, filled with the sounds of children's laughter and the lowing of healthy cattle. Life was good, settled, and sure. One morning, Eliza was in her herb garden, humming softly to herself as she tied up the new shoots of a climbing rose bush. The sun was warm on her back, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of damp earth and fresh blossoms. She reached up to secure a stray vine, and a sudden wave of dizziness washed over her. The world tilted, the vibrant colors of the garden blurring into a sickening swirl. The ground seemed to rush up to meet her, and then there was only darkness. It was Timothy, the runaway boy who found her, crumpled in a heap by the rose trellis. His terrified shout brought Luke running from the barn, his heart seizing with a cold, familiar fear. He saw her lying there, so still and pale, and for a terrifying second, the world went cold again, just as it had the day Mary died. He swept her up into his arms, her body unnervingly limp, and carried her into the house, shouting for someone to ride to Redemption and fetch Dr. Adams. He laid her on their bed, his hands trembling as he loosened her collar and bathed her face with a cool cloth. She began to stir, her eyelids fluttering, but she was weak and disoriented. The wait for the doctor was the longest 2 hours of Luke's life. He sat by her bedside, holding her hand, his face a grim mask of anxiety. The entire ranch fell into a hushed, worried silence. When Dr. Adams finally arrived, his buggy coated in a thick layer of dust from his frantic journey, he was all calm professionalism. He shooed a worried Luke out of the room and began his examination. Luke paced the front porch like a caged animal, the rhythmic creak of the floorboards a torment. He imagined every terrible possibility, a hidden sickness, a weakness of the heart, the brutal toll of all her hard work finally catching up to her. After what felt like a lifetime, the bedroom door opened. "Doctor." Adam stood there, his face a strange, unreadable mixture of disbelief and utter bewilderment. He held his spectacles in his hand, polishing them with a handkerchief as if he couldn't trust what he had just seen. "Is she all right?" Luke demanded, his voice raw. "What is it?" The doctor looked at Luke, then back into the room at Eliza, then at Luke again. "Luke," he said, his voice full of a stunned wonder. "I was the one who told her. I examined her myself. I saw the scarring. I told her it would be a miracle." "What would be a miracle?" Luke asked, his patience gone. "For God's sake, man, what is wrong with my wife?" "Dr." Adams took a deep breath. "There is nothing wrong with your wife, son. In fact, everything is precisely, miraculously right." He finally looked Luke square in the eye, a slow, incredulous smile spreading across his face. "Eliza is with child. I'd say she's nearly 3 months along." The world stopped. The wind, the chirping birds, the frantic beating of Luke's own heart. It all went silent. He stared at the doctor, certain he had misheard, that this was some kind of cruel joke. But the look on the old man's face was one of absolute, baffled certainty. Slowly, as if in a dream, Luke walked past him and into the bedroom. Eliza was propped up on the pillows, her face pale, but her eyes wide and luminous, filled with the same impossible, dawning wonder. She looked at him, a question in her gaze, needing to see his reaction to believe it herself. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, his movements full of a reverence she had never seen. He didn't speak. He simply reached out a trembling hand and laid it, ever so gently, on her stomach, on the place he had touched in hope, in prayer, in silent acceptance. But this time was different. This time, it was not a dream. Beneath his palm, sheltered in the body he had been told was barren, was the impossible, miraculous truth of a new life. New life. Tears streamed down his face, silent and unchecked. He leaned forward, burying his face in her hair. She wrapped her arms around him, her own tears of disbelief and overwhelming joy beginning to fall. After a moment, he pulled back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. Then he stood, and with a strength born of pure, unadulterated joy, he lifted her from the bed, carrying her as easily as he had carried her from the garden. He walked out onto the sun-drenched porch, into the bright morning light, holding his wife in his arms. The worried faces of their ranch family turned toward them, and seeing the tears and the radiant smiles, they understood. A collective, joyful gasp went through the small crowd. Luke held Eliza close, his face buried in her neck, and whispered the words that were the truest thing he had ever known, a prayer of thanksgiving for the woman who had remade his world. "You brought life back," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just to the land. Eliza, you brought it back to me." 7 years passed, each one layering the Broken Horn Ranch with a richness and vitality that would have been unimaginable in the desperate days of its past. The name no longer fit, but it remained, a humble reminder of what had been broken and what, through love and sheer grit, had been mended. The ranch was no longer a quiet, lonely outpost, but a thriving, bustling community. The main house had been expanded, with a new wing built to accommodate the ever-present collection of souls who found their way there. The laughter of children was the ranch's constant, joyful music, not just one child, but many. There was Sarah, now a thoughtful and kind young woman of 13, Timothy, the runaway, who was growing into a capable young ranch hand under Luke's tutelage, and a handful of other children whose families had found temporary or permanent refuge under the Callahan's generous roof. And then there was Daniel. He was 6 years old, with his father's stormy eyes and a shock of dark hair, but he had his mother's smile, a smile that could light up the darkest corners of a room, a smile that was in itself a miracle. The town of Sandstone had changed, too, or rather, its perception of the Callahans had. The ranch was now one of the most prosperous in the region. Luke's herds were healthy, his lands were productive, and Eliza's meadow was a lush, green testament to their success. Prosperity earned respect, but it was Eliza's character that had earned the town's awe. One sun-drenched Saturday, Eliza drove the wagon into town for supplies, Sarah sat beside her on the bench, no longer a timid child, but a confident young woman who handled the horses with an easy skill that mirrored her father's. In the back of the wagon, Daniel played a quiet game with a set of carved wooden animals, his happy chatter a soft counterpoint to the rumble of the wheels. As they pulled up in front of the general store, the proprietor, Mr. Henderson, the same man Eliza had once had to bargain with for a fair price on feed, came bustling out onto the porch. "Mrs. Callahan, a good morning to you. We just got in a new bolt of fine blue wool. I set it aside for you, thinking of you first." Eliza smiled, a graceful, knowing smile. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Henderson." As she stepped down from the wagon, Mrs. Gable, who was arranging a display of canned goods nearby, turned. The hawk-like sharpness in her eyes had been replaced by a look of deep, almost reverential respect. She smoothed her apron and gave a small, distinct nod of her head, a gesture that was as good as a curtsy in this part of the world. "Ma'am," she said, her voice quiet, "a pleasure to see you." The whispers that had once followed Eliza through this town were now ones of admiration. They spoke of her gardens, her kindness, the way she had healed the sick and sheltered the lost. The story of how she had saved Sadie's baby was town legend. They no longer saw a barren woman. They saw a matriarch, a pillar of their community whose strength had become a source of their own. Later that day, as Eliza was loading the last of their supplies, a group of young women, barely older than Sarah, approached her hesitantly. One of them, a newlywed named Mary Ann, looked particularly troubled. "Mrs. Callahan," she began, her eyes downcast. Could we ask you something?" Eliza turned, her full attention warm and inviting. "Of course, dear. It's just," the young woman stammered, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. "Life out here is harder than I thought. My husband, he works so hard, but we've had no luck. The well is low, and my first planting failed. Sometimes I feel like I'm failing him, like I'm not enough." Eliza's gaze softened with a deep, compassionate understanding. She led them to a quiet bench in the shade of the store's awning. She didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. Instead, she pushed back the sleeve of her left arm, revealing the faint, silvery tracery of an old burn scar. "The first year I was here," she said, her voice quiet and clear. "This land was cracked and bleeding. The house was silent. My husband's heart was closed, and the people in this very town looked at me with scorn." She looked directly at Mary Ann. "They called me a fallow field. They said I would bring my husband to ruin, and for a long time, I believed them." The young women listened, rapt, their own small troubles momentarily forgotten in the face of this quiet confession. "I have learned that life is not about the hand you are dealt, but how you choose to play it." Eliza continued. A tear welled in her eye, not of sorrow, but of remembrance, and she did not wipe it away. "There will be drought, there will be fire, there will be people who try to define you by what you lack. You must not let them. You must find the strength not in your womb or in the soil, but right here." She gently touched her own heart. "You plant the seeds you have. You tend to them with all your might. You fight for them. You love them. And you will be astonished at what can grow from the most barren-seeming ground." She stood, her presence radiating a calm, unshakable strength that had been forged in fire and watered with tears. The young women looked at her as if she were a prophet. She had not given them a solution to their problems, but something far more valuable. She had given them her truth, and in it, they found their own hope. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, golden fingers of light across Eliza's meadow, she and Luke sat together on the porch swing. It was their favorite time of day, a quiet, sacred space carved out just for them. The sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft clucking of chickens heading to roost, the faint, melodic laughter of the children playing in the yard, or the symphony of the life they had built. Luke had his arm around her, and her head rested comfortably on his shoulder. They didn't need to speak. Their years together had woven a language of comfortable silence between them. He watched her gaze, which was fixed on the horizon, her face serene in the fading light. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. She smiled. "Marianne, in town today. She reminded me of myself, all those years ago. So scared, so sure she was a failure." "No one could ever look at you and see failure. Eliza," he said, his voice a low, certain rumble. "They used to," she reminded him gently. "And so did I. For so long. I thought my only worth was in having a child. I thought that was what made a woman a mother." Luke was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. He looked out at the sprawling, vibrant ranch, at the sturdy barn he had built, at the green fields, at the children who were all, in some way, hers. He thought of the terrified, grief-stricken man he had been, and the whole, happy man he was now. He turned to look at her, his stormy eyes filled with a love that was deeper than any ocean. "Not everyone who bears a child is a mother," he said, his voice thick with a conviction that came from the very core of his soul. "But you, from the very beginning, you were the only mother to everything I had." His words were the most profound truth she had ever heard, the final, healing balm on a scar so old she had forgotten it was there. She lifted her head and kissed him, a soft, lingering kiss filled with the quiet gratitude of a shared lifetime. Just then, a small figure broke away from the group of playing children and came running toward the porch. It was Daniel. He scrambled up the steps, his face bright and flushed from his game, his dark hair a wild mess. He launched himself into his mother's arms, burying his face in her lap. Eliza wrapped her arms around him, her heart overflowing. She breathed in the scent of him, of sunshine, dust, and little boy. He tilted his head back and looked up at her, and his face broke into a smile. It was a smile of pure, uncomplicated joy, a light so brilliant it seemed to chase away the last of the evening shadows. It was the smile of a miracle, not the one that had happened in her body, but the one that had been happening all along. It was the irrefutable proof that love, true and patient and tenacious, could always find a way to bring forth life, even in the driest, most desolate desert of despair. Thank you for listening to this story from our past. We love sharing these tales of the wild frontier with all of you to help our community grow. We'd be so grateful if you'd comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from today. It's always a joy to see how far these stories travel. Please consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel and sharing your own thoughts on Eliza and Luke's journey.